Thank you. So yes, we are. I thought when Matt put together the description of the talk tonight, it was a good kind of way to put it how the two worlds of Angular and .NET are kind of blending, and you start to see that more with all of the different ways you can do things now. It used to be like the web developers were over here and the server guys were over here, or that's not so much the case anymore. You start to see people that kind of cross that boundary a lot. And this presentation or this topic is definitely an example of that. Angular Universal bridges that gap, and it's just one example of the many ways that you could bridge it. So that's what we're going to dig into. At a real high level, it's going to be pretty informal. These are the kind of high-level things, what it is, or who I am, what it is, what Angular Universal is, a gut check on whether or not you should consider it for your tech stack or the problems you're facing currently. A little demo at the end, and then Q&A I have on there. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, just stop me or whatever, just ask them as they come to you. Before I get started, is there anybody in the room that is using Angular? Just any type of Angular? Okay, good. That's good. So we'll have some context there. And so there's a basic understanding of, does everybody in the room kind of understand what a single page application is too? Because that's kind of a base level we'll have to be aware of too. Okay, so digging in a little bit more, I'm Colin Forster. I work here at Buildertrend. I've been here about 5 months. Previously, I've been doing various things, primarily web development. Recently in my career, it was mostly JavaScript, client-side development, browser mostly, and then Angular kind of got popular in 2012, 2013, primarily focused on that, and then it was heavily JavaScript after that, wherever JavaScript was being written, which anymore is kind of everywhere. Whether or not it should be, it seems like it is. So that's kind of where my experience lies, and that's kind of how the presentation came to be, of the Angular world is creeping back into the server, and you can kind of see how it folds into the .NET environment here with the demo that I'm going to show you. So digging right into it, right into the meat of this, what Angular Universal is. In the traditional single-page application setup, when a user makes a request to the server, index.html gets served down to them regardless of the route that they request. And so that bundle, index.html, gets sent down, browser renders it, downloads all the other assets. And then when the user can actually see your app with the data that they need to see inside of there, that's the red arrow on the far right-hand side. When you add Universal to the picture, they get to see that valuable content and start interacting with your app at the green arrow. And depending on how big your single page application is, the gap between the two arrows could be like half a second all the way up to, I've seen 5 seconds, 10 seconds. I mean, it can get pretty wide, that gap. And so Angular Universal kind of solves the problem between that gap. You might have heard of it in the past referred to as isomorphic JavaScript, just referring to the fact that it can be ran on both client and server. And the way that it accomplishes this is by rendering the application on the server and then transitioning all of the data that it fetches for that specific request seamlessly to the client. So if you are on Amazon.com, let's say they're using Angular Universal, they don't, but if they did, and you're searching for new tennis shoes, if you type in a search, you can see the URL at the top, it's updating, and so you're making a request all the way back to their servers for certain types of tennis shoes. In the Universal case, when the query comes back and the data comes back down to the browser, the server is going to hand that off seamlessly to the browser so that when the single page application takes over, it doesn't have to refetch that data. In a traditional single page application, there's no transition there. It hands down the index.html and then it fires off all of the web API requests to actually fill the user's page with data. So it's shrinking that gap in between. And how it does it is the two modes of rendering that it has is pre-rendering and re-rendering. We're going to talk about the latter. Pre-rendering, you typically see it with blogs or any type of static sites where you can pretty much generate all of the pages up beforehand using Gulp or Grunt or any other Maven, NuGet, whatever build process you have, you could probably use to generate beforehand. So that's pre-rendering. We're not going to talk about that today. It's going to be all re-rendering here. So digging in a little bit deeper to talk about some of the high-level problems that it solves. I touched on the gap events. That's everything between the two arrows. So back to the Amazon example. If you load up the home page and you want to start typing in that search bar right away, with Angular Universal, you can do that because it will record all of those user events before your single page application kind of takes hold and starts recording the events, updating client-side models, things like that. Pre-Universal world, the user would have to wait for your index.html to completely render the whole thing and download all of your application assets. That can take a lot of time and ultimately cost you a lot of money. Seems like every couple of years, Google or Amazon puts out those research articles about half a millisecond cost Amazon however many millions of dollars a year. So it's very applicable to those types of situations. The async bullet point up here is referring to typically in server-side code, when you are building a request to send back down to the client, you actually have to do all of the work and then draw a line in the sand and say, okay, request.send, send it back down to the client. Angular actually has it set up so that when you are working inside of your application code that could actually run on the browser or the client, or I'm sorry, the browser or the server, you don't have to know what environment you're in. You can just continuously update the data as if you were always on the browser. But if you're thinking from a server standpoint, that doesn't make sense because it's just one HTTP request that you think would just get sent back down to the client at once. Angular Universal takes care of that kind of chicken and egg situation for you. Environment dependencies refers to if you were using local storage in your application. Local storage obviously isn't available in a .NET application, so you would have a different implementation of the service that invokes local storage, and you would provide it differently to the server side. When it's rendering on the server, it wouldn't use local storage. Maybe it would just use an in-memory object or something like that. Whereas on the browser, it would rely on local storage. Application state is talking about handing that data seamlessly off from the server database request down to the browser so that when the browser application renders, it doesn't make the duplicate API request. And then app container, we're not really going to dig into it today, but that's if you've heard of progressive web applications or the offline apps or things like that, there's a lot of neat built-in tools inside of Angular Universal that can get you like 50% of the way there of turning your app into an offline capable kind of progressive web app just by turning on a couple of flags inside of Angular Universal. So that kind of talks about the what of Angular Universal and some of the high-level problems that it solves. So now that I've kind of thrown that at you, these are the checkpoints that you can run through and ask yourself, are these for me? And I should have mentioned earlier, I grabbed these graphics from ngConf, the big Angular conference that they do, because I thought I couldn't come up with anything better. These really, I think, enunciate well of how you're going to determine whether or not you should care about Angular Universal, kind of the flow chart you can go through. So are you in an e-commerce product or any product or company where your initial load time is going to impact revenue or bounce rate or anything like that? And if the answer is yes, then you should care somewhat about maybe considering Angular Universal or some other approach that would kind of shrink that gap between client render. Does your product or application need to be searchable or discoverable by search engines? Google said in the past that Angular Universal isn't the end game for SEO, but as of now, 2017, that it's the best that they have and that they will provide for Angular applications. There's a lot of hacks and workarounds that you can do for Angular 1, but this kind of takes it to the next step. And we'll dig into that in the demo. And then the third check you can say is if any of my users is going to share a link to my application on like Twitter or Facebook, those social networks will like render a thumbnail and a nice pretty clip preview of what the page is that was linked. Angular Universal will help them do that for you. So if you answered yes to any of those, then Angular Universal is at least something you should consider for the problems that you're having. And if the answer is no, then you can continue with your client-side application approach. I like the next graphic. So if you look at it from a pattern perspective, and not Angular specific at all, so are you using Angular 2, then you should care about the patterns. Do you think server-side rendering is neat? Then you should care about the patterns. And are you a web developer? Then you should care about the patterns. So I always get a kick out of that. Okay, so today, if you had to leave right now and you were going to run back home and implement Angular Universal in your app, where would you get started? And I would point you towards the ng CLI, the command line application or command line tool that the Angular team spent a lot of time and effort research building with the development community, trying to make the developer experience way better. They got a lot of heat for it in the Angular 1 world, and they definitely did their homework on making that better in the Angular 2 world. So that would be the first place I would point you to. I put sort of there in parentheses because it's not just one command. I think the next slide has it. There's actually 2 commands you have to run, but it's pretty slick and easy to get set up. As far as different languages, tech stacks, it's pretty easy to adopt depending on where you're at. .NET and Node definitely have the 2 best supported environments. Java, PHP, and the other ones are kind of on the way, but that's more of a community effort. Depending, the larger the open source community for those specific languages, the earlier you're going to get that support. And if your Angular app uses Angular Material, that's still a work in progress. So if you think about your home page, if it has a bunch of Angular Material UI components, and that needs to be rendered on the server so that it can be sent to a web crawler or something like that, those have browser-specific dependencies like the document or the DOM model or things like that. That's not available on the server, and so it's up to those libraries to actually provide a server-side implementation of it, whether it's just, say, fail silently and don't blow up the thread, or provide some other implementation of it. Yeah, so this is the ng CLI. So it's after installing the CLI tool, it's really just the one command to generate an Angular 2 application, and then it's the third command down here, this platform server, to actually install the final piece of turning on Angular Universal. In Angular 1, they started to kind of add universal support, and in prior versions of the new Angular, so back in Angular 2, Angular Universal is kind of like this side project that was running parallel. But once it got folded in to the official team and everything, it got this first-class citizen support, which makes it easier to adopt. And you'll kind of see that here if you have an existing Angular 2 app and you need to fold it into your .NET stack, there's like probably 4 or 5 files you need to add. It's not much work for as much that comes out of the box. So
support the latest and greatest Angular version. So let's say, can I use the HTTP client module in my Angular application that's universal Angular, or
yeah.
behind it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it does support the latest. The demo application or the starter kit that I used, that is like an extra frosting on top of the CLI app, was built from 4.x. Angular Universal got folded in as of Angular 4, so it's first-class citizen starting then. So if you're using any of the stuff from then on, it's going to be 100% supported. But like this .NET starter kit, you can see it's got a ton of stuff up here. They have like little demos of all these different tools and stuff that you can use. And this is it's becoming a more and more popular starter. It's almost got 1,000 stars, which is pretty cool. A lot of community involvement here to keep it on the latest version of Angular, so that questions like yours is hopefully always a yes, because the community's keeping it updated, which is pretty cool. So we're going to step through the application to kind of talk about the key pieces of those concepts that we covered in that earlier slide. We're going to talk about pre-boot, which is covering those gap events. It's everything that happens between the green and the red arrow. re-rendering and state transfer. So just some quick, easy examples. I was thinking about this earlier, that the examples themselves, or the demo themselves, they're not very flattering, but if you appreciate everything that the Angular team or any implementation of a server-side rendering tool has to go through to kind of do this and then seamlessly hand it off to the client-side application, it's pretty neat that it can happen for as little effort that the dev has to put in on our end. So this, I tried to draw out this application tree so that we understand at a higher level kind of how the three modules interact. If you already have an Angular application or an Angular 2 application, you have this piece, kind of the bottom part of the tree in the right half. And then the server side entry points are going to be the red squares in the top left corner. So like I mentioned, the files prefix of boot, those are your entry points depending on if it's a client-side application rendering in the browser or if it's a server-side request. And then the next step down is where you would do your platform-specific dependency injection. Like the example I used was local storage not available on the server, so you have to inject a different type of service there to handle your local storage calls, because that's not going to be there on the server. And then down below is all of your regular application code, and this would not be aware of where it's actually executing at. It would, make its HTTP calls as normal, use the regular Angular 2 services, and everything would continue as it does in the browser. Your code wouldn't be the wiser of what's actually going on. So this particular template has a lot in there already, and I'm going to point out the high-level pieces of it and then kind of step back and forth between here and the code so you can kind of see. So client app is all of the client-side code. If you already have an Angular application, you'll be very familiar with this folder. This is all of your components, models, any of your shared code, things like that. The home controller is actually our only controller for the application. Every request to our web server is actually going to get filtered through this home controller, and it gets passed off onto a service that will render our Angular app, and it's done here. We'll come back to this, but it's important to note that this is our only controller, so if they're requesting for /users or /lazy, we'll get to those examples later, that it all comes through this home controller and will render the same result. And then finally, these are your REST API controllers. This is your typical controller that you've probably seen 1,000 times. It's your CRUD operations, saving data, persisting data. So there's nothing groundbreaking here other than I wanted to point out the distinction between this home controller, which is your normal kind of view controller that would be rendering your ASPX pages. It's not actually rendering anything, and it handles the request for all of the views in our Angular Universal scenario. Okay, so stepping on, we're going to dig into the code a little bit now, talking about the server entry point. Try not to bore you too much with this part of it. A lot of the stuff comes pre-configured out of the box. It's just important to know that so your JavaScript, or in this case TypeScript, the entry point for the server still gets compiled down to a JavaScript file, similar, just like it would in the browser. And when the .NET piece of it gets a request for index.html, it's going to invoke a node process, and the node process runs this JavaScript file. That's actually how it does it. It's just a wrapper around node. And so that's what this boot.server file sets up for us. Important things here would be the HTML tag that the client-side application is actually looking for, and then any of the server-side providers. This is another key spot. So this is where you would provide your storage provider, or if you have any components that are going to be rendered that need DOM access or window access, you would have to provide some other API that they could hit against here that would keep them from blowing up when the request came in from the server. And then, so going one step further down, this is going to set up, it's going to pass those dependencies off to the app module from the server standpoint. So it's really similar. It's going to configure pre-boot, which is catching those events between the two arrows. You can do cool things there about like only capture click events, wait so many seconds before you replay them. This is where you're going to set up the API state transfer. So make the API request on the server. It's going to call your database server side. It's going to stuff that data into the HTML when it passes it down to the client so that the client doesn't refetch it. Stepping forward, so the browser side of it is everything that, for those of you in the room that already have an Angular app, you already have this piece set up. The only things that you would have to add would be your client-specific environment providers, and then also telling the client app to expect or to look for some type of state from the server. You would need to tell it to go out and say, hey, the server might be stuffing some data in this index file for you. Go out and look there before you actually make another API request. So if we kind of look at it from start to finish, user makes a request to /users. It's going to invoke that home controller. And this is just a little helper. And you can see here that ultimately it comes down here and it's rendering to a string. It's just going to send a giant string back to the browser. And this is all of the hooks into the Angular API where you can pass it. You know, you can configure it all sorts of different ways. But the important thing to take away from here is that it's taking in a .NET Web API request, stuffing it into a Node process API, and then that API is returning a string, and that string is being passed on back down to the browser. So from a, I guess, implementation perspective, difficulty perspective, there's not a whole lot to do to actually add it to your stack if you already have Angular. So we step over to, here's the demo running. So if I refresh the page here, on the users page, it's actually fetching this list of users from the API. If I refresh this and filter the network traffic, there's no /users call here. And that's not very flashy, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes of keeping the browser, the client application, from actually refetching that request. And now if I navigate away from it and come, so now the app's running in your traditional client-side application mode. Angular Universal has nothing to do with this anymore. If I go back to the users page that I entered the application to, you can see the /users data request now. So it's just that initial render that it really saves, unless you have some type of caching mechanism set up in your application code. So yeah, that's what I was showing here. Is it's in browser mode, you navigate to another route, it's going to refetch that data in this specific example. So I'm going to show you guys something really fancy here about how they're transferring the state. You're all going to be blown away. You view the source. This specific implementation is just shoving it in a window global object. You know, you can implement, the Angular leaves this up to you to implement, but the key thing is that the server side actually set that window object. It's configured on both ends of the Angular Universal side to say, I'm setting it on this key, make sure and look for it there from this key. So that's actually how it does it on the implementation side. Can you guys, I don't know if I can zoom in. I can. There we go. I'll go back down to it. Yeah, so it's just a global window variable that the API is going to read from before it actually goes over the wire and makes that HTTP request. And if you come down a little further, all this gobbledygook is actually the pre-boot UI event recording code that we will do an example of here in a second. Okay, so if I, over here in the browser, I want to show something. I have an artificial network delay of 5 seconds. To say I'm running on like a 2G network connection. So I've added a 5-second delay just to really emphasize that gap between the red and green arrows. So if I refresh the page here, and here I'm on the Amazon homepage and I want to search for something, and I click add. You see the screen like blanked out here, telling me that it's still loading. The 5-second delay finished, the blanked out section went away, and then my user's API request actually went across the wire. I'll do that again. It's hard to see because I'm zoomed in. Clicked add. It's frozen because it's still bootstrapping. You know, my network's really slow. I'm still downloading the assets. Angular pre-boot recorded that A that was typed in, and then the add button clicked. Once the client-side application bootstrapped, it replayed those same keystroke events so that the API request will get made, and my search or my add in this case wouldn't be lost. So that's a big feature that comes right out of the box with Angular Universal. And all it is just a true-false flag whether or not you want to enable it, and then you have to tell it what HTML tags or what events to listen for in the application. So that's pretty slick to come right out of the box. And then, okay, another key piece of the demo application I want to touch on is lazy loading. Is everyone kind of familiar with that concept? Don't load it until you need it, so to speak. In Angular 1 or any kind of pre-2016 client-side application framework, lazy loading was more difficult than it should have been. This was kind of a first-class priority in Angular Universal. So with preloading enabled, all that it says is download the initial important stuff first, bootstrap the application. So that means all of the stuff that the user is looking at or actually asked for is ready on the page. And then go download all of the stuff that you've said, these are lazy routes. These are routes that are probably going to be hit, but you don't need to load them right away. So I have that enabled right now. If I set this back to all and refresh the page. So here's that 5-second artificial delay again. And then as soon as that's passed, you'll actually see another web request go through right here. That one right there. For this JavaScript file is that final chunk of the Angular module that was lazy loaded into the application. The other scenario is don't load any of the modules until the user actually clicks on it or asks for it. So this is for like your kind of deep dark corners of your application that you're not really sure if anyone uses, but you don't want to slow down that main page for them. And all that is this preloading strategy. I'm just going to turn it completely off. And refresh the page. And so now you'll see if I wait for it to load, wait for my 5-second network delay again, that lazy module shouldn't be loaded. Yeah, so you didn't see that 0.js come across anymore. That module didn't get loaded until I actually click on it. I can't see, I think this is the link. Nope, zoom too far in. Okay, so now I'm the user, I'm navigating to that dark corner of your application. It's not very flashy, I know, but it made the request for that application, that piece of the Angular module. It was downloaded runtime, kicked into your application and rendered. Like I mentioned before, that's not very flashy on the surface, but if you are still in, or you ever were in an Angular 1 world and you tried to do that, it would be a lot more difficult than just that line of code that I commented out. It's not given to you out of the box. There's a lot of kind of working around the framework instead of letting the framework work with you to accomplish the same thing. So if I had to kind of wrap it up and summarize everything, if you have an Angular 2 app and you want to add Angular Universal to your stack to solve some of the problems we were talking about, you could definitely get started with that today. And if you are already a NG-CLI application, that's something that could be done in less than a week. It's the caveat to that, though, is that it's still maturing, like I mentioned. If you use Angular Material or any other UI framework that doesn't kind of proxy itself from browser dependencies like the DOM or any local storage, things like that, you're going to hit some bumps in the road, and you'll kind of have to code around those, build yourself a little bubble. It's not for everyone, so use those super sophisticated flowcharts that I showed at the beginning to determine whether or not Angular Universal is for you. And then the demo project that I was kind of stepping through here, and also the slides are linked to from this GitHub page out here. I'm sure I can share those later with whomever if you guys are interested. Is there any questions?
So what would be one of the examples where you can really use this versus being fully client side as occasional API calls to your backend?
So I gave a very similar talk to this. It was on Angular Universal, but it was a Node example at HDC about a month ago. And someone came up afterwards, because up until then, I didn't know anybody that was running it in production. And there was two people that came up, and they were kind of sharing war stories. And both of them were e-commerce applications where they need SEO, really strong SEO support, and then the immediate searchability. So they spent a lot of effort getting the above the fold to load very quickly. Well, that was great, but their Angular application wasn't actually bootstrapping quick enough just because the user could see the input text box. They couldn't actually use it because the JavaScript behind the scenes wasn't finished downloading and executing yet. So both the examples that I personally know of is e-commerce, but otherwise it's kind of SEO, e-commerce, or the social sharing links are your kind of three key indicators that if you're struggling in any one of those areas, that would be a scenario you'd want to look into Universal. Yeah.
As far as on the client side, is there a trade-off between CPU usage or data usage between Universal and Valve?
From the perspective of like your app bundle is bigger, or it's making more data requests?
Not necessarily more data requests, but more overall data being transferred. Is it easier on, say, a mobile device as far as how much data usage,
Yeah.
average data usage for doing the same thing with Universal versus without Universal?
Yeah,
It sounds
that's
like more stuff is happening on the server, so does that necessarily require more data is being transmitted because instead of the
that's
client
a
device actually executing that?
that's a good question, because I'm actually going to use it to kind of answer the question that he asked a little bit. Another use case that they gave was, and this was the bullet point at the beginning, talking about the app container or progressive web apps. So on your server, you can make a bunch of checks about the client coming in. Do you have a good connection? What kind of browser you're running? Then you can make further assumptions. This is a low-powered device and low connectivity environment. Then you can just run your app completely server-side mode, so that you're not making a bunch of client requests in a low connectivity environment. Whereas an Angular app a completely client-side Angular app would bomb out in those scenarios because it doesn't have the fallback mechanisms built in. But if you're expecting to run in either one of those, you will take care of those situations. So I guess the answer to your question is you can control it, whether or not you want the client to do most of the work or you want the server to do most of the work. Did that answer your question? Or did I just give you more questions? Okay.
Well, I guess I was thinking if there was an overall, overall view of, hey, if you do this, be aware there's probably going to increase the data usage. Sounds like there isn't.
Oh, no.
It's kind of depending on what you're doing.
Yep. From a data usage perspective, your clients won't notice a difference because your app bundle should be the same size. Like if you have an Angular 4, I guess technically app, already today, and you turned on Angular Universal, there would be no fluctuation as far as data usage goes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if your employee example that you've given to us, did you find or do they talk about best practices as far as the size? So size of data itself, let's say you had data that you know that you're going to be using all the time, but the size is huge. Is there any kind of
Like-
best comments, okay, you're supposed to be doing data up to this?
Should you stuff that in a global object, and at some point that's going to impact something, right? Like you can't just put 5 megs of data in.
In reality, it's going to be not one object.
Right.
Obviously, you're going to have so many on that page, but potentially the application level. Is there any recommendation out there on this?
That's a good question, and I didn't point that out in the code, but the caching service that actually, here we go, that stuffs that window object is actually something that you implement, or that the Angular team hands off to the developer to implement. They have a bunch of examples out there to do really basic stuff, but the code ultimately, it lives in your code base so that you can control the scenarios of, I know that this part of my API is going to grow way out of hand too quickly, but I also know that the other 50% of it is something that I can just cache. So maybe you could do some URL checking or some other type of logic to say whether or not you should do that state transfer. And then the only difference is the request is made from the client instead of the server. So I guess it would stay the same as how you're currently doing it today from a client-side Angular app. Good question. Any other? What's that?
What kind of stuff are you doing at Buildertrend right now?
So at Buildertrend, our tech stack is not Angular. It's actually, so all of our stuff is, I can't say all of it, most of it is server-side rendered ASPX pages. And then we have client-side components written in Knockout that will make the page more interactive. Try to avoid full postbacks refreshes of the page. So we kind of do both worlds. You know, if you go back to the original slide of the 2 arrows, we have the 2 arrows solved except the state transfer in between. So we do a few of the concepts from here, but nothing to like near this sophistication.
Is this where you'd like to see the future?
Yeah, it would certainly solve a lot of problems. A lot of the things that are challenging for Buildertrend as we grow are the list views of, you know, every entity has a list view, and we've all dealt with list views before, paging and all that stuff. Ultimately, it ends up being like an Excel sheet that you're just scrolling through and loading on the web, right? So this would solve a lot of those problems, at least on that page 1 load time. Whether or not it's Angular, I don't know. That's another discussion. But
Is there a migration path that you guys are looking at to get there?
we have a migration path for other pieces of our kind of client-side tech stack. Angular's not really the end goal at this point, but adopting more of the client-side approach is. So removing more, I guess putting more UI components and UI work in the client. You know, relying more on Knockout or React or whatever client-side framework we choose. It's leveraging that more than the server-side.
So you guys use React?
No, we don't. Nope. But that's one of the candidates of, like, you know, as we outgrow Knockout, because Knockout was, it still gets a lot of support, and actually it's really popular in the .NET community. So it's great from that perspective, but at a certain point, it's yet to be seen if we will outgrow it from, because it's not meant for a full single-page application, and we're not sure if we actually want to go there, but so we kind of have to keep all options open while not cornering ourselves too much in a completely server-side or a completely client-side world.
Yeah, Redux handles some of that stuff with React.
The universal?
Redux, yeah, Redux, like some of that state issues too.
Mm.
State management issues.
Mm.
But it's not part of React though, so want
Okay.
to configure that on your own.
Okay.
Which part of this code running on the server?
Yeah, I know that's it's not very clear. So when I make a request to users, this page here, the code that actually gets ran on the server is first going to be this controller, this home controller. Okay, and it's going to kick off this pre-render helper that is going to invoke this TypeScript file. It won't look like this when it gets invoked, but at some point or another, this is what gets hit. So if we go back to this controller, this pre-render result is going to be a string. Or they must serialize it into a JSON object that is just going to inflate a view. And it's just, you know, a layout file that you've seen hundreds of times before. It looks, you know, not much different. So that there's not a whole lot that actually gets hit on the server. And then the other piece of it that I want to skip over is, you know, your actual API calls. So that stuff's still on the server.
Okay.
Good question. Any other questions? No? Well, thanks for being a good captive audience for me.